Hello and welcome to today's training. So today we are going to look at climate change, ecosystem-based adaptation and systematic adaptation assessments. Today we are going to look at the series 2 of this training, and a few days ago we had the series 1. So for a while now we have been discussing climate change, and today we are going to look at how climate change can be mitigated and how adaptation can be approached through ecosystem concepts. So as a way of introducing us to this concept, there is a growing recognition of the role of a well-managed ecosystem can play in supporting adaptation, and this could be through increasing resilience and decreasing vulnerability of people and their livelihood to the impact of climate change. So this has informed us that a well-managed ecosystem can help to increase resilience of individuals or community and help them also to decrease the vulnerability to which they are exposed to climate change related hazards. And also well-managed ecosystems have a greater potential to adapt to climate change, resist and recover more easily from extreme weather events. And it can also provide a wide range of benefits for which the people will depend on. And also, poorly managed, fragmented and degraded ecosystem can increase the vulnerability of people and nature to the impacts of climate change. This could be really assessed from the angle of our own studies and intergovernmental panel on climate change. Climate change is a change in the state of the climate that can be identified by changes in the mean or the variability of its property, and which persists for extended periods, typically decades or longer. So what this is trying to tell us that when there is a change in the climate within a particular area, and this has persisted for a long duration, we can actually be certain that there is climate change within that environment. Before now, we had rains, we could predict when the rains will be coming and when we'll be having the dry season, and the floods were not as persistent as what we are experiencing now. So when we have all these changes that are persisting for a long duration, it is certain that we are actually experiencing climate change. Another concept of climate change is that it may be caused by nature or human factors, and the natural process that causes climate change may include volcanic eruption, changes in the solar radiation, and the human factor activities, which is the greater percentage of the causative factors of climate change, include land use changes and activities that leads to emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through anthropogenic activities by humans. Also, climate change poses great challenge to society, particularly in developing countries. It has been reported that the impact of climate change could reverse decades of human development gains and also threaten achievement of Millennium Development Goals. So the developing countries are the ones that are actually being impacted the most, that are highly vulnerable to this climate change. So let's look at the impacts of climate change. What are the actual impacts that we could be sure and certain that humans are actually being impacted by climate change. First of all, we could look at it from the angle of an increase in atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. And as noted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide have increased to an unprecedented level. And with carbon dioxide concentration rising by 40%, this is a very huge value which really have an impact on the global climate. And this increase is primarily from fossil fuel emission and secondary from net land use change emissions. So those are the main sources of these climate change or greenhouse gases that leads to climate change. And furthermore, global average temperatures have also been reported to increase at about 0.8 degrees Celsius since the early 20th century, and with about 2/3 of this increase occurring from the 1980s. So a global average change in temperatures, which has been reported since the 20th century, could be one of the impacts of climate change. And furthermore, changes in rainfall pattern, such as the onset, the duration, during the spell frequency and the rainfall intensity, have become a common phenomenon in many parts of the world. So these changes in rainfall regime have resulted in more intense rainfall, bringing an increase in the risk of flood. So one of the impacts of climate change could be certainly be looked at in terms of changes in rainfall pattern, whether we decrease in rainfall when we are supposed to be having more rain, or maybe the changes in the pattern whereby when you're supposed to be expecting the rain, they are not actually having the rains, and this could lead to increase in floods. Another impact of climate change is drought, and drought has created famines and food insecurity in Africa, especially and has further propelled a global spike in malnutrition. So it has also resulted in death of livestock and asset loss for pastoralists. So considering that developing countries in Africa are at greater risk and more vulnerable to its impact of climate change. So drought is one of the events or one of the factors you could actually determine that there are an impact of climate change. And also climate change also contributes to human migration, which can trigger conflicts over scarce resources such as land and water. A typical example of this could be seen in the aspect of the pastoralists, maybe in cattle rearers moving with their cattle from one region to the other in search of pastures for the cattle. So this human migration can trigger conflicts, whereby there could be conflicts between farmers and herders, and this is a result of the scarce resources in terms of the land and water and the greener vegetation which they need for their cattle. So this is one of the impacts of climate change. And also climate change has a wide-ranging impact on economies of developing countries, that is especially in Africa especially. And Africa's food production system are among the world's most vulnerable because of their extensive reliance on rain-fed crop production, high intra and interseasonal climate variability, recurrent droughts and floods, and these affect both crops and livestock. And also the persistent poverty that limits the capacity to adapt to newer or improved agricultural techniques could be as a result of climate change. And other projections based on the continued high emissions level suggest that changes in territorial ecosystem throughout Africa with additional warming poses a high risk for the survival of some species, and also reduction in groundwater from low rainfall areas and a rise in sea level. So all these are impacts that climate change could have on economies, on the food production system in terms of agriculture in developing countries. And furthermore, human influence has also been detected in terms of ocean warming. And these are oceans that have been reported that oceans have absorbed much of the increased heat within 700 meters feet of the ocean. So this absorption of the ocean leads to ocean warming, and this in turn affects the biodiversity in terms of the aquatic animals that you have. And another impact of climate change could be in terms of ocean acidification. And since the beginning of industrial revolution, the acidity of surface ocean waters have increased by 30%. And this increase is a result of human emitting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and more being absorbed into the ocean. So the absorption of this carbon dioxide into the ocean bodies and release of some toxic chemicals as a result of industrial activity leads to ocean acidification. And finally, the global mean sea level has been reported to increase to about 17 centimeters in the last century, and the rate in the last decade is nearly doubled. And this could be also seen as one of the impacts of climate change. So, further from this impact of climate change now, how do humans adapt to this climate change? So climate change adaptation includes any initiative or action in response to actual or projected climate impacts that reduce the effect of climate change on built natural or social systems. So any initiative or action that is adopted that could lead to reduction in the effect of climate change could be described as a way of adaptation to climate change. And this adaptation focuses on the process of decreasing the level of exposure to the effect of climate change by both nature and human. So nature and human adapt to climate change by trying to decrease their exposure level to the climate-related hazard. And according to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the adaptation will be seen as a process of adjusting to the actual or expected climate and its effects. And adaptation is about moderating or avoiding harm from the effect of climate change, and this can be done through interventions by various actors. And one of the interventions could be through ecosystem-based adaptation approach. So before we look at the ecosystem-based adaptation approach, let's look at what ecosystem services, what is actually meant by ecosystem service. And it could be defined as an ecological process or functions having monetary or non-monetary value to individuals or society at large. And these include benefits that people obtain from ecosystems such as the food, the fuel, the freshwater, regulation of soil erosion, landslide, floods, disease outbreak, non-material or tangible benefits from recreational and spiritual benefits of natural resources. So these are all ecosystem benefits, and these benefits are derived from humans, from the ecosystem. For instance, forest has a way of filtering the water system or providing nature with a watershed, whereby it has a way of filtering water which is now abstracted by humans for consumption. And also in terms of the fuel that humans obtain from forest and the food, this serves as ecosystem services which nature has provided to man. Now let's look at the ecosystem-based adaptation. How do humans adapt to climate change using ecosystem services? And according to the Convention on Biological Diversity, ecosystem-based adaptation refers to adaptation that integrates the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services into an overall strategy to help people to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So in a nutshell, what ecosystem adaptation means is the integration of biodiversity and ecosystem as services. The ecosystem services that are listed earlier, such as the food, the fresh water, the erosion control system that ecosystem gives out to human, is one way of understanding the ecosystem-based adaptation approach to climate change. And also, ecosystem-based adaptation uses sustainable management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystem to provide services that enable people to adapt to impacts of climate variability. And also, the approach contributes to reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience to both climate and non-climate risk, thereby providing multiple benefits to the society and the environment. So the key measures or strategy that is adopted through ecosystem-based adaptation is by conserving, management, and restoration of the ecosystem services, which would also enable humans to adapt to the impact of climate change. So in terms of the concept of ecosystem-based adaptation, the effects of climate change directly threatens the services that ecosystem provides. And so the services such as food, clean water, coastal protection, and soil stability. And communities which depend directly on the exploitation of local natural resources are threatened most severely and are also most likely to lack resources for costly adaptation measures. Now, there are several adaptation measures that have been introduced or adopted by the society or humans to adapt to climate change. But ecosystem-based adaptation could be unique in terms that it is one way whereby humans adopt cost-effective measures of adapting to climate change. And ecosystem-based adaptation could involve activities like protecting and maintaining the ecosystem integrity, buffering local climates. Example, in terms of maybe looking at extreme weather conditions like cyclone or maybe tsunami or tornadoes. So villages with wide coastal mangroves buffers will experience significantly fewer deaths than villages with a narrow or no mangroves at all. So mangroves are stretch of forest within an aquatic ecosystem, and it has been observed that destruction to this mangrove forest could increase the vulnerability of humans to adverse effects of climate change. So ecosystem-based adaptation in terms of helps in terms of buffering local climates where the mangrove forest has actually been protected from deforestation or destruction activities of humans. Another way of looking at ecosystem-based adaptation is in terms of reducing the risk and impact from extreme events such as storms, drought, and sea level rise. Also, ecosystem-based adaptation involves providing and maintaining essential ecosystem services that help people cope with changes in water supply, fisheries, disease, or agricultural productivity that are caused by climate change. So, in terms of benefit of climate ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation provides nature-based solution to reduce vulnerability even under high climate risk. So one unique aspect of ecosystem-based adaptation is that it is nature-based. You don't need to employ high-level technology or have to develop or come up with a high-tech solution in order to adapt to climate change. It's nature-based as long as we attend to protection and conservation of the natural environment. The natural environment will provide the services that will help in reducing the vulnerability of humans to climate change. And this could be seen, example, in terms of by maintaining and restoring natural infrastructure such as the mangroves, like I said earlier, coral reefs, and watershed vegetation. So ecosystem-based adaptation may reduce vulnerability to extreme weather events like a storm surge, rising in sea level, and changing precipitation pattern. Also, ecosystem-based adaptation can be cost-effective, like I said earlier, in terms of the ecosystem-based adaptation provide a cost-effective strategy for reducing vulnerability in terms of the degree of exposure to loss or injury as a result of the impact of climate-related hazard, and it also to change the impact and increase resilience in terms of the capacity to resist the disturbance that has been caused by climate change. So another benefit of ecosystem is that it provides multiple benefits to community. And a typical example of it is that watershed conservation and wetland restoration can act as a buffer to future impact of flooding and mudslide caused by extreme events associated with climate change. And also it can also stabilize slope surrounding the relevant communities and ensure a continuing supply of drinking water. So these are the multiple benefits of adopting ecosystem-based adaptation to mitigating the impact of climate change. And also, ecosystem-based adaptation cannot be excluded from the overall strategy to address future risk, even though it may have to be supplemented by other measures. So, in any way you are trying to address the impact of climate change, you cannot take away the importance of integrating ecosystem-based adaptation, even if you have to employ the use of technology. Ecosystem-based adaptation still has to be integrated as a way of mitigating the impacts of climate change. So what are the forms of ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change? Ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change recognizes that ecosystem services play an important role in reducing the vulnerability of people to climate change. And its main focus are to promote societal resilience through the management and conservation of ecosystem. And this will be achieved by the restoration of mangroves for protecting coastal settlements against storms. That's one of the forms of adapting to climate change using ecosystem services. And also the conservation of upstream forest or with any forest within an environment that helps to regulate water flow and control erosion for the benefit of vulnerable communities is one form of ecosystem-based adaptation. Another form of ecosystem-based adaptation is by sustainable forest management, which help in the provision of safety nets to livelihood. This could be seen as a typical example whereby forest products can provide safety net to local communities with the climate variability that's being caused by crop failure. So, whereby a situation whereby humans or environment is experiencing failure in agricultural production, proper forest management could serve as the last resort, whereby providing safety net in terms of livelihood, or maybe whether from food or the forest resources that are obtained from the proper management of these forests. It could serve as a safety net to provide livelihood to humans that are experiencing adverse effects of climate change on their agricultural crops. And also in terms of habitat preservation, you can look at that in terms of maybe setting up protected areas, strategically setting up protected areas that cut across different habitats, whether it is savanna zone, whether it is rainforest zone, whether it's aquatic or wetland. Setting up protected areas within these strategic habitats could help to deliver ecosystem services, which helps to adapt to climate change using these ecosystem services. So those are the forms of ecosystem adaptation to climate change. Now let's look at the adaptation assessment approach. How do we assess adaptation to climate change? First is by sharing knowledge and to approaches to adaptation and examine the existing measures. So the sharing of knowledge and approaches about the need for the importance and concept of relating to adaptation could be a very important step in assessing the adaptation to climate change. So efforts should be made to create a common understanding on the integrated measures to addressing climate change, which consists of both mitigation and adaptation. Also, the second step has to do with assessing the risk associated with climate change impact. And this is done by collecting and analyzing existing and readily available monitoring results or information. So this could be in form of past meteorological observation and data and that have been conducted independently. So assessing the risk of climate change impacts using existing information will definitely help in assessment of the adaptation approach to climate change. And impact and regions where risk are particularly high should be identified using the current knowledge and the data that are being obtained. So the third step in assessing adaptation or approaching in terms of adaptation assessment is by promoting communication and deciding adaptation plans and programs and measures. So by promoting communication, you have to share the risk assessment result with the public and the stakeholders. You don't have to keep the information to yourself. And this approach can have the effect of facilitating subsequent communication and decision making related to implementation of adaptation measures. And it can also help to determine the necessity of adaptation measures that are considering the levels of importance and prioritizing adaptation planning and implementation policies. And the fourth step in the adaptation assessment is starting with the most visible initiative. And this could be in terms of initiating urgent response measures to prevent and mitigate short-term impact of climate change, and also considering adaptation measures where socioeconomic benefits are clearly higher than the cost. So where socioeconomic benefits are higher than the cost, you could look at that as the most visible initiative, and where you can effectively assess the adaptation of communities to climate change. And also by tracking and assessing progress and effectiveness of the adaptation measure. This will help in terms of overall assessment of the progress. This will help in assessing the adaptation approach, whether it's effective or not. And the final step is in terms of consolidating the risk assessment and adaptation measures, which is based on monitoring and the latest knowledge that have been obtained from the assessment. And this could be in form of identifying areas and items that require priority monitoring and considering improvement methodologies and arrangements. So by assessing areas that through prior monitoring, it could help to improve the methodologies that have been used in adapting to climate change. And also, it could also be in terms of improving future projections using the latest research results and local monitoring data. So from the monitoring data, it could help to project how adaptation or how climate change could actually impact communities and how the adaptation assessment could be adopted. So finally, in conclusion, there is a way of concluding. Many recent climate change adaptation initiatives have focused on the use of technologies and the design of climate resilient infrastructure. However, there is a growing recognition of the role in which healthy ecosystem can play in helping people adapt to climate change. And also that is recognizing the climate change directly impact on ecosystem, which provide for the needs of the people as well as maintenance of a natural ecosystem-based adaptation can provide cost-effective strategy for reducing vulnerability to climate change impacts and thereby enhancing ecosystem resilience to humans within a particular community. Thank you for listening to this training.